Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor and Sylvie Kapani.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for the introduction. And Sonia asked me to speak first. The first thing I should say is thanks very much to Sonia for all she has done, not only in organizing with the many, many helpful people here these celebrations, for which we congratulate the Sikh Foundation and Dr. Kapani, but also on this book, certainly. It's a great teamwork, and thanks to her. We first actually started talking about this book many years ago, and in time for the Foundation's event, actually made it happen in the last few years, and thanks to all the authors, many of whom are here today. And I understand it just got released night before last from Customs, from the printer. Had we known, maybe we could have worked a little longer on it and done a few more things, but no, I barely made it in time, and then that was scheduled that way. So, like everything else you seem to have done for these events, just worked beautifully. The volume honors the art historical resource that's assembled by Narinder and Satinder Kapani on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Sikh Foundation. And we did this compilation to honor those events and those people in the way that we thought was the most appropriate. And that is by bringing together really leading scholars of Sikhism and Sikh art to assess and interpret the Kapani collection, using it to introduce Sikh art as well as the Sikh ethos to a broad public. And I second Marianne's comment about please recommend this to libraries and others. I do think, I will say that if you've seen the book out there, and we'll just go through some comments about it and overview of it very briefly so that you all have more time to read it. But it really is meant to be a well organized and available book to a broad general public that will also be useful to scholars. We asked each author to include information about where people can find other kinds of information, and we took a lot of time and effort to make sure that the illustrations are beautifully done and have captions and are tied to the text in a way that that statistical portion of the public, which we know always takes these books and just looks at the captions, and the pictures with their captions, will already get a lot of good information. And others who want to read on any particular subject can start anywhere and can also have a very enjoyable time starting from the beginning and reading all the way to the end. So not all art books are written that way, but that's how we hope this one was done. When we say Sikh art, though, there's already something to be said right from the start, which is that the field of Sikh art itself is one that Dr. Kapani effectively defined, at least for purposes of his own collecting, in the introduction to the 1999 publication of conference proceedings on Sikh art and literature, which was hosted at the Asian Art Museum where we had last night's event. And the definition is broader than most because it doesn't just include Sikh religious themes or Sikh artists, but, quote, he wrote, art that is by, for, or about the Sikhs. Several of the people who contributed articles in this compilation have commented on the breadth of the collection that resulted. It doesn't include just something that's limited to what we might consider fine arts. It includes a vast scope, paintings, prints, and sculptures, of course, but also textiles, books, prints, coins, stamps, and historical memorabilia of all kinds. But really, this cannot possibly be called an eclectic collection. It's very much the opposite. It's a highly focused collection of exceptional breadth, let's put it that way. And so I would conclude that the creativity that developed fiber optics seems also to have been poured into this creation of a new field of study and a collection of art that's worthy of such a definition of Sikh art. It's hard to remember that before the 1980s, Sikh cultural phenomena were often treated as a kind of subset of Hindu culture. And ironically, if you look at that 1999 book, sometime open up and look at the little colophon at the beginning where the Library of Congress has cataloged the book. You'll see it's cataloged at that time as Art, Hindu, India-Punjab, meaning it's the book about the Punjabi sort of flavor of Hindu art within India. But this was how people thought. And of course, that's been the success of the attention given and the emphasis given to the new field of Sikh studies and Sikh art as a field of its own. So in thinking about how to assemble a book of essays on Sikh art from this collection, we thought it was best to divide the essays into three parts, and that's what we'll be talking about. We will, once again, I just really want to thank all the renowned scholars who contributed chapters, some of whom will be talking after us today. Part one is called The Collectors and Their Vision. And that's because that seems inseparable from an understanding of the Kapani collection. The three authors describe the passion and vision of Narendra and Satinder Kapani. And first we have the chapter by Kiran Kaur Kapani, the couple's daughter. Okay. And that recounts the personal histories of her mother and father, including how they met in their early years in the United States. But it also remembers how Sikh art collecting became their inspiration for establishing the Sikh Foundation in 1967. The second chapter, something from her chapter. The second chapter is by Gurinder Singh Mann. How do I do this? Which reflects on both the professional and personal accomplishments of Dr. Kapani, demonstrated both through his groundbreaking work in fiber optics and, of course, his incomparable art collection. He explores the relationship between Dr. Kapani's Sikh identity and his philanthropic work, and he reviews the creation of the Sikh Foundation, describing the establishment of endowed Sikh studies professorships, artistic sponsorship, and museum exhibitions that he launched or supported, suggesting that his legacy is built on the Sikh belief, as he puts it, that liberation is not personal but collective. We asked Gurnam Brard to write about a very little known period of Narendra Kapani's life, which I myself only found out about recently, during which he experimented with creating his own works of art, something that he called dynoptic sculptures. I suspect that many of you who know about his art collections and his work don't know about this period, but he had a period in which he repurposed fiber optical building materials into various sculptures. Brard's own memories of that period illuminate a time when he and other friends of the Kapanis developed an informal appreciation of these works, which then began to draw critical notice from museum professionals and went through several invited formal museum exhibitions and really very, very positive press reviews of Dr. Narendra Kapani as an emerging artist. And he concludes with summary descriptions of selected dynoptic sculptures that were created before Kapani stopped making them. So for the editors and surely for most readers, this chapter provides a kind of window into a lost chapter of Dr. Kapani's own creativity. I want to tell an anecdote. Some of you, I hear that some of you were not here yesterday, so I'll tell the same anecdote that I said yesterday. When this book was almost essentially completed already, we asked Narendra Kapani if he considered these dynoptic sculptures to be Sikh art. Because, you know, we had that definition. What is Sikh art? It's art by, for, or about the Sikhs. But if you know, if you think about any definition too long, it starts breaking down around all of its edges, and this is true of this definition like any others. But it was a wonderful working definition, and these details never prevented Narendra and Satinder Kapani from amassing a wonderful collection. But we asked him, did he consider these to be Sikh art? And he seemed surprised by the question. I think this is a correct way of recounting the anecdote. But then he answered, no, I don't think so. And then after a pause, I think he must have realized the conflict with his own definition. And he said, are they art? He said, they seem to me more like Sikh playthings. But he then reminiscent, recounted again the story of how, he started making them, and then people discovered them. Then you had museum exhibitions and lots of people coming and exhibit openings and cocktail parties and press reviews. But it was so much effort because they were so complex and they took a lot of time. He said, that's why I stopped, because they just took too much time. So then we pretty much agreed, yes, those are not Sikh art, because Sonia and I can never, although we've worked professionally with the Kapanis for many years, we never remember him ever expressing that sentiment about Sikh art. But we were very happy to include this chapter as well, as what's going on? As the third chapter in part one about the collectors and their vision. And the second part, which Sonia will be talking about, is the Kapani collection, a survey of Sikh history and ethos. And I believe that the illustrious scholars who contributed chapters to that have examined and used the artworks within the Kapani collection for the purpose that it was really intended to serve, which is to introduce and examine the culture, history, and ethos of the Sikhs. Step back.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. It has been an honor to work with you and learn from you so much along the way. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that it takes a community to make a book and to make it a true success. Our book started with this marvelous collection put together over a lifetime by Satinder and Narinder Kapani. I believe this collection is an invaluable resource intended to introduce and examine the culture, history, and ethos of the Sikhs. Our deep gratitude to all the artists whose spectacular works are contained in this book, without whose work this book would not have been possible. Both Paul and I are deeply grateful to all the 15 illustrious authors who have contributed their scholarly works to this volume. Then the team that put together all of this into 320 pages. The designer Sumit Singh of Chandigarh, who took the 295 pictures in this book, the copy editor, Mark Woodworth, who labored through all the chapters, and the remarkable editorial assistance that we received, always with a smile, from Paul Trevor of the Smithsonian, Rupi C. Tutt, the artist in residence at the Sikh Foundation at that time, and Inderjeet Singh Thakkar, our intern. All of us were given total support from our families and friends. And I would also take a moment to thank my husband, Devender Singh, for his support all through the years. And lastly, the real success of a book is accorded by the readers. The success of a book in today's times is mostly how many copies it sells. But a true measure of our book would be if it can introduce to not only to the Sikh community, but the whole world, the breadth and the expanse of Sikh art. It engages the reader with not only paintings and sculptures, but also Sikh coins, which are unique in numismatic history. Sikh stamps, which are from all over the world, from countries like Netherlands, Norway, Bhutan, Pakistan, who have commemorated stamps on the Sikhs' achievements, and textiles, which are now claiming their rightful place as art. While we would love for you to buy your copy today and take the time to read the fascinating and informative chapters, also keep a copy near your children, which will encourage them to at least look at the pictures and take the first steps to getting engaged. And also, we request you to ask your libraries, your local schools, colleges, and universities to get copies. With this, I now take you through the book through the second part of the book, which is the Kapani Collection, a survey of Sikh history and ethos. So part 2 of the book begins with the chapter, The Sikh Gurus, Works of Art in the Kapani Collection, written by Dr. Pashora Singh. In a chapter illustrated by Devinder Singh's magnificent series of contemporary paintings of the 10 Gurus, he lays out the history of Guru Nanak's vision and the community that coalesced around his teachings. He summarizes how the Guruship and Sikhism would transform within the context of South Asian politics in the centuries to follow, culminating with the establishment of the Khalsa by Guru Gobind Singh, as well as by the transfer of authority to the Guru Granth Sahib. Dr. Nirvikar Singh's chapter returns to this key subject by examining many of the other portraits of the Sikh Gurus in the collection, noting the historic and stylistic changes from the Mughal-inspired portraits of the 18th and 19th centuries to contemporary portraits such as those by Arpana Kaur. Dr. Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh then surveys the Guru Nanak at the Asian Art Museum, a richly detailed study of the unbound set of 41 Janam Sakhi illustrations donated from the Kapani collection to the San Francisco's Asian Art Museum. She interprets for us all the visual vocabulary and language of these late Mughal-style illustrations that collectively recount the story of Guru Nanak's life. Dr. Mohinder Singh's chapter then employs a beautiful selection of images of the Harmandir Sahib to discuss its architectural history and its spiritual significance to Sikhs worldwide. Dr. Jean-Marie Lafon's illuminating chapter on arts and culture in the Punjab Kingdom and the Sikh states Trans-Satluj and Cis-Satluj examines a vast range of the Kapani collection artworks relevant to his topic. He recounts the political history of the formation of the Punjab Kingdom and the Sikh states around the turn of the 19th century and their relationship to Delhi, the East India Company, and other contemporary political entities. He concludes by advocating for renewed interest in the Lahori School of Art and greater recognition of its significance within the history of Indian art. Peter Bain's chapter on the Maharaja and his faith traces the biography of Maharaja Dalip Singh, who was removed from the Punjab following its annexation to Britain in 1849 and relocated to Europe. Illustrating his history with artworks from the Kapani collection, Peter paints a sympathetic portrait, examining the Maharaja's conversion to Christianity and also the motives behind his eventual return to the Sikh faith. This chapter is followed by the Sikh martial tradition by Navtej Sarna, who argues that a Pacific faith developed a militant nature in response to years of political and religious persecution. He describes how the military accomplishments of Guru Har Gobind and the martyrdom of Guru Tegh Bahadur inspired Guru Gobind Singh to establish the Khalsa and change Sikhism forever. The third part of the book is further studies in the Kapani collection, and it invites the readers to examine in more detail specific aspects of media of Sikh artworks within this collection. First, Jyoti Rai's chapter, The Nanak Shahi, the Divine Sikh Coinage, surveys the numismatic history of the Sikh kingdoms, such as the silver rupees and copper paisas from the Lahore, Amritsar, and Kashmir mints, alongside coins from various historical periods of Sikh rule, in addition to temple tokens of commemorative medallions. Dr. Henry J. Walker follows with his chapter on the Kapani stamp collection, which chronologically represents the collection's Sikh-themed postage stamps from around the world. Several of these are modern issue stamps printed to commemorate significant Sikh anniversaries, while others depict great Sikh athletes and writers recognizing Sikh contributions to many fields. Dr. Kristen McKnight Satie then provides a chapter on textiles in the Kapani collection, Faith and Identity in Silk, Cotton, and Wool, which begins by pointing out the difficulty of placing this material within the traditional definitions of Sikh art and promoting the more inclusive attitude that the Kapani collection encompasses. This allows inclusion within art historical studies of the numerous examples of meaningful contributions to our understanding of Sikh cultural life that results from analysis like those Satie presents of the fulkari, rumal, and other textiles. Dr. Marianne Milford Lutzker then examines several significant Sikh artists of the 20th century, including Sukhpreet Singh, who is here with us today, Arpana Kaur, who has also come all the way from India for our 50th anniversary, and Devinder Singh. She views their artworks through lenses of devotion, work, and play, and emphasizes the importance of considering their art to be expressions of a deeply personal Sikh faith. And in the final chapter, Dr. Paul Michael Taylor provides a different kind of further study within this collection by examining ways in which Sikh art is transformed by being exhibited within museums. With this, I now invite Dr. Paul Taylor to please come and speak in a little more detail about his chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. I'll be very brief, as we've so briefly summarized other chapters as well. But this is the entrance to the exhibition that I worked on, which gave me a lot of opportunities to think about this topic and write about it now here, that how Sikh art is transformed in museums. And one of the issues, I'll just quickly cover a couple of the issues that I look at in this. One is the issue that, sorry, how do we get this to go? Sorry. One is that when we began working on this topic of how to represent Sikh culture and heritage in a museum context and in a museum, we faced the issue that many people in the Sikh community imagine that their heritage should only be represented with a very restricted number of items, and that actually the American public and publics around the world are interested in a much broader range of topics, that there was a very strong focus on items associated with the gurus themselves, that many people thought we should go borrow from India and so on. But actually, we developed an exhibition which was much broader than that and was very effective for millions and millions of viewers. But we couldn't have done it, I will also add, without having access to a large collection. The Smithsonian historically has essentially no Sikh collections. And so we describe a little bit about how museums go about forming exhibitions and research projects and so on. And in this case, we were very dependent on access to a collection. And although the initial impetus to do the exhibition came from a broader Sikh community, it's only when Dr. Kapani actually agreed and wrote a letter agreeing to let us use his collection that we were able to move forward with building forward the exhibition. I would say that the museum had a requirement to basically involve a contemporaneous large Sikh community, especially after 9/11. It became obvious that it was much more important to inform a broad public. And that's what an exhibition is, one of those things that can do, alongside the things that we were talking about in this morning's panel about education. And one of the things we saw is that very popular is when individual community members, we see in this case the opposite interest of the exhibition. These are individual community members from the Washington, D.C. area who essentially write something about how we're your neighbors, we're your friends, please come in and find out about our heritage. And we saw that as the exhibition, after it closed in Washington and traveled to Santa Barbara, Fresno, San Antonio, Texas, and other places, everyone imitated this, and even when it was nearby here in Fresno, local community members did that. I'm talking about the transformations of Sikh art in museums, and so what people saw as interesting and wanted to ask questions about, we found this is when the exhibition traveled to San Antonio, Texas, a lot of interest in local Sikh history. So they did a much larger gallery about Sikhs in Texas. This is the Gurdwara in Houston, a depiction of it in the background. And at the museum, people had turban tying demonstrations and little places where people would show children, would have workshops with children, teaching them different things like how to find Punjab on a map and so on. So there were a lot of issues of how to represent Sikh heritage and what was heritage and what wasn't that we faced, and that's one form of transformation and is what the definition of museum-worthy objects are. But also we saw a lot of cultural accommodations, we can say. For example, the tremendous importance of the Guru Granth Sahib in Sikh culture and art and history, we wanted to depict that. And so we had this as part of our exhibition. This is after the introduction to the 10 Gurus and Guru Gobind Singh's, the creation of the Khalsa, and we have this section called Sacred Books Becomes the Last Guru. And a small, this is where in Texas, we have it also in all the other venues, but we use a little label there that explains that if the Guru Granth Sahib is present in the room, people should be covering their heads and not wearing shoes as a sign of respect, and this is not possible in a museum environment. So we're just using a prop in place of the actual Guru Granth Sahib. We thought, most museum goers like to see real original artworks, but this was one of the most interesting things when we did surveys of the public. One of the most interesting things that people most remembered was the thing that wasn't there, rather than the thing that was. There's a lot in here, and I don't have time to go over it all here, but I want to encourage you to take a look at issues of conservation as they apply to the transformation of Sikh art when it comes into museums. The first thing I would note is that very often Sikh art is traditionally not made to last. I mean, the beautiful greens that come from the use of verdigris to illustrate Janam Sakhi and other manuscripts on paper are inherently damaging to the substrate of paper and will be eating their way through. The adhesives that are used to put those beautiful ivory miniatures onto the velvet that's often used to display them, those little ivory medallions are being eaten away from the back by the adhesive itself. Armor that's in touch with textile is bad for the metal and bad for the textile. So things are constantly sort of in a state of deterioration, and preservation is a huge issue in Punjabi art and Sikh art. And this is why in 2006 we organized a conference in Chandigarh on this topic of museum preservation and historic site preservation. But there's also sort of a philosophical issue about this. So, for example, we see that here's the example of the verdigris. That's what made that beautiful color, but it's also essentially eating away at the paper unless it is chemically neutralized. So this is all over Sikh art. We have these issues, and because the Guru Granth Sahib is like a very honored guru, there's traditionally in some parts of the Punjab the ceremony to cremate a deceased, we can say, or manuscript. So this is something that I have to say is very jarring to museum professionals, no matter how respectful we want to be of local traditions. There's an inherent conflict between those who want to preserve and those who want to honor by destroying, which we can certainly understand. And that is another example of the kind of transformation that is taking place, that Sikhs increasingly are exposed to contemporary techniques of preservation, which are still in development, and many Sikh scholars are participating in the development of new techniques. But because of that, just as there was a kind of seva, or gur seva, to honor the guru by burning a manuscript, there's now a form of service to community by trying to aid the conservation of old art and preservation of historic sites. And I see that that has become a form of seva within Sikh communities, for which museums actually have a big contribution. Here we are with some of the repairs taking place. At the same time, putting anything on exhibition has inherent risks, because just as actually storing a collection has risks, just keeping it in a vault has a risk, or keeping it at home. But this is an example which is very unfortunate. This was an absolutely beautiful necklace of Rani Jindan from the Kapani collection, which was exhibited at the Smithsonian, and it was returned to Dr. Kapani afterwards. The Texas venue is one that chose to try to borrow this again, and was borrowing it, never received it, but by a very professional art transport firm, which is used by all the major museums. This was picked up at the Kapani's home and signed for and everything else, but it never reached Texas. Its whereabouts are still unknown. This is a very unusual phenomenon, but it occurs. And so we all know that exhibitions are wonderful things for education, but there's always a risk involved. Just as with textiles and with artworks, this exposure to light over time can cause a very, very slight additional deterioration, even as museum exhibitions are inherently good for collections normally. But this is the kind of balance and the kind of consideration that we have to take. And this has been true of every exhibition all over the world. Well, I want to mention that these were some comments of mine about some of the many aspects of transformation of Sikh arts, but I very much appreciate the contributing messages which we added on this topic to the book, one from Forrest McGill, who's the curator here at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and also from Susan Strong, who's with us here today, her contributing message, which we also put in the book on this topic of the relationship between the Kapani collection and museums. I think all of us know that without Dr. Kapani's tremendous collection, and now some other collections building up around the country too, but particularly Dr. Kapani's collection, without access to that collection, it would not have been possible to do any of the Sikh exhibitions, the major Sikh exhibitions which have taken place here. And we look forward to continuing work with this collection, in which there's so much still to be done in terms of publication and research. And just thank all of you for the opportunity to have worked on this project. Thank Dr. Kapani for the opportunity to have worked with his collection in the past, and look forward to continuing into the future. And wish the Sikh Foundation all the best for the next 50 years for that reason.